And when you just heard the news, just in general, like that she's missing and that your brother's back here,
I don't understand as much as everybody else. I'm learning everything from the news, too.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. That was Brian's much older sister Cassandra, or Cassie, from an extended video clip from ABC7 News. In this episode, we'll be looking and listening both at the extended video and audio, as well as the even more extensive transcript to this conversation. Some crucial comments from the 32, or some people say 31-year-old Cassie, are edited out of the extended video clip, but are nevertheless unredacted from the transcript. There is an instance, for example, where she says, "Actually, I don't want to say that." And interestingly, she said this after partially answering the question, "So you didn't know that he came back without the question mark?" And the interviewer was asking about the van. Cassie, who is fairly coy and soft-spoken in the interview, actually interrupts the interviewer here to say, quote, "I assumed he flew back because that's what he did when he is. Actually, I don't want to say that." We can only speculate why she cut herself off and what she meant to say. When he is what? Something else to consider is if the couple was struggling so much financially that they couldn't afford for one of them to stay in a hotel on August 12th, following the Moab incident, and we've seen this footage in the second body cam. We've seen and heard it. We've heard Brian saying that they really don't have much money. How could Brian afford to fly back to Florida on August 17th from Salt Lake City and then fly back again to Utah on the 23rd to resume their journey? Meanwhile, putting Gabby up in a pretty spiffy hotel during Brian's absence, the Fairfield Inn and Suites. And if you can see from these images, it's quite a nice hotel. It's even got quite a nice swimming pool and I think a gym. So yeah, it's quite posh. And this is where Gabby stayed while Brian was helping his father empty a container, apparently back in Florida. Also, didn't Brian and Cassie see one another during this 6-day visit? Also, surely Brian confided in both parents either directly after the Moab incident, leading to them summoning him home, or during the 6 days that he spent at home, or both. If this is the case, and if Brian had expressed misgivings about Gabby and the engagement, this is meaning while he was on the road, as well as this project, the nomadic static project, it's possible his parents gave him a pep talk and sort of encouraged him and pushed him into giving Gabby and the whole project another try. It's also possible he either asked for money or they gave him some in order to get the show back on the road. Before we continue with this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen to subscribe. And let's get started. So this 6-day break and the stay in the hotel, what do you think happened during this interlude, this intermission in their summer epic, in their relationship in a way, and also in their journey across America? What do you think was happening? It's possible that this break, this 6-day break, may have been done on purpose to allow Gabby time to settle, to work on her blog, and also perhaps for things to cool off, for the stresses to subside, and so that things could cool off sufficiently so that they could start again, resume their trip kind of on a clean slate. Does that make sense? The point I'm trying to emphasize is if Brian's parents and also Cassie were instrumental in guiding him back into the relationship. Now, notice the word if, right? I'm trying to emphasize a possibility, a potentiality. We don't know if it's true, but it's possible that if Brian's parents and Cassie were instrumental in guiding Brian back into the relationship, encouraging him to go back to Salt Lake City, despite certain reservations perhaps from him or even from Gabby, and then something went wrong, one could see how they might see themselves somehow responsible for Brian, for putting ideas into his head and then wanting to make amends after that. Does that make sense? It's just an idea. It's just a theory.
Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way.
So there you heard the oracle from the Matrix, and let's do exactly that. While we're on this topic, I also want to raise 3 obvious points regarding the family dynamic, more specifically the sibling dynamic, that haven't, as far as I've seen, been raised until now. And we're going to deal with 3 separate points. The first one is Cassie's age. Cassie is older than Brian, 8 to 9 years older, depending on which source you go to. There's an article on Fox today that put her at 31 years old. I saw another one on Heavy putting her at 32. But so she's around about 8 to 9 years old. That's quite a substantial gap. In sibling terms, she's obviously the leader of the 2 kids, especially when you're at quite a young age. And that leadership is expressed in certain status aspects. Her status in terms of perhaps employment. I don't know what her education is, but she's already married. I've heard it's with a guy called Jimmy Lusix. It's difficult to pronounce, but it's spelled Luycx. And I've heard it rumored that he's from Guatemala. I'm not quite sure where he's from. And so her surname is actually not Cassie Laundrie. It's Cassie Lukes, or Lakes, or Lasix. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So she's married, she's got children, and so in terms of her journey through life, she's certainly a lot further along that road than he is. And of course, he's trying to, I guess, catch up. He's trying to get to the point where from engagement to married. And is he going in the right direction? Was he going in the right direction during July and August, and especially the last 2 weeks of August? And if things weren't going very well, in fact, if things were going really, really badly, how would he feel about in telling his family this, given perhaps a sense of expectation? And if you've been in a family like that where your sibling has gotten married before you, or you've gotten married before a sibling, you probably know that some of these pressures can be quite severe. The fact that Gabby is sending postcards during this trip to Cassie's kids and Brian is within this role as Uncle Brian makes the engagement make a lot more sense. Brian is trying to achieve par, as I said, with his sibling. She's married, he wants to be. She has kids. I don't know, maybe he wants kids as well. So there was very likely a kind of family pressure for Brian to get married relatively quickly because his sister had been or was. Whereas there may have been a different pressure on Gabby to not get married. Gabby's own parents had divorced. Both of her biological parents obviously had divorced. And so one can kind of imagine they would have advised caution. Compare that to the fact that Brian's parents are still together, and so they may not see marriage as such a big risk or that anything can go wrong. And so they perhaps should have seen Gabby in terms of Brian's relationship with Gabby as quote-unquote about time in terms of Brian, especially compared to their eldest daughter. It is something where Brian is not being seen in his own terms. He's being seen compared to the eldest daughter. Does that make sense? That brings us to the second point. Cassie may see herself as a protector for Brian, and these roles are very important. It's very important to establish the identities of people in true crime, and the family dynamics show how those identities are linked to one another, how the strings are pulled, so to speak. The psychological strings are pulled. They tend to go along the channels, along the pathways of certain family dynamics, and these aren't often very obvious. These are quite difficult to see and to, often the family members themselves in a situation like that aren't going to disclose them. And so one's got to intuit them, one's got to figure them out, one's got to find out something that the people themselves at the heart of it may not want to show. And of course, there's certain ways to see these relationships without really even talking to these people or looking very hard. You look at things like ages and things like status, marital status, and so on and so on. So I reiterate, Cassie may see herself as a protector for Brian, more so than many may perhaps have realized. Why? Well, because she's not a little bit older than him. She's almost a decade older than him, right? She's a lot older than him. Also because she's a mom. She's a sister. She's got her own home. She's sort of established in her life to a much greater extent than he is. He's still living at home. Does he have a job? Does he have a life? Does he have a wife? She's about 8 or 9 years older than Brian, depending on which source you go to, 30 or 32 years old, and he's 23. She probably has looked after him throughout his younger life, when he was perhaps prior to him being a teenager, when she was still living at home. And she perhaps performed the role kind of a second mother occasionally. And perhaps they've got a very close friendship, a very good relationship, because Brian doesn't seem to have very many other friends. So you can imagine his relationship with his sister being an unusual bond, right? And so that may have a bearing on the fugitive dynamic. It's difficult to say. It's just something I think that one's got to consider potentially. It may also explain why Cassie may have been less than honest by some appearances about her contact with Brian. That's certainly been reported in the media right now, and it is something that her lawyers brought up as well, saying, well, it was just a misunderstanding. She didn't get a clear question, and the answer may have been confusing, really. In any event, it's possible that the idea of contact with Brian or no contact with Brian is because she's trying to protect him, like she always has. I'm just putting a question mark then, saying, could that be a factor? And that brings us to the third and final point. Cassie is the most communicative member of the Laundrie family. Now, juxtapose that with point number 2, that she's a protector, and the question of did she have contact or didn't she? Well, Cassie's the most communicative member of the Laundrie family. She's communicated with the media, and we saw the postcards. Does that mean she may have communicated with Brian in the past 2 weeks? And I'm saying, besides these 2 occasions where she apparently had contact with him at the DeSoto campsite, and I think there's another occasion as well, these contacts that have only come to light now, have there been other contacts, other communications besides what we've found out about now? I see we're at over 13 minutes into this episode. I'm not going to take it further than that. I do want to deal with highlights from the transcript, so I will do that in the next episode. So consider the next episode essentially a part 2 to this one about Cassie. I also want to say congratulations to the Springbok rugby team for an excellent match against New Zealand. If you're from New Zealand or from Australia, I'm sure you'll agree it was quite a nail-biter. If there are any South Africans listening, high five. I'm sure I don't need to tell you or ask you how to feel about this game. It was quite an incredible, colossal contest, wasn't it? In any event, on that note, I hope wherever you are, you're enjoying your weekend. Stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time.